Indirect objects. It's the somebody you give something to when you give something to somebody. Really, there actually is a better definition. And it's when you have a direct object and somebody receives the direct object, or something receives the direct object, it's the indirect object. So, we already talked about subjects, we already talked about direct objects. And a direct object receives the verb, but sometimes there's a person or a thing on the other end receiving that direct object. That's going to be called the indirect object. And just like the other parts of the sentence, if we do things in the right order, it'll usually lead us to the indirect object. So here are some basics that you need to know about indirect objects. First of all, they're always nouns or pronouns. They have to be, can't be anything else. Secondly, indirect objects never come inside a prepositional phrase. And like everything else, there's going to be prepositional phrases that have a noun in it that's very tempting to label as the indirect object, but it's not. Indirect objects may never be inside a prepositional phrase. There's actually a name for that noun in the prepositional phrase. It's called an object of a preposition. We'll get to that later. But indirect objects, never in a prepositional phrase. The indirect object has to receive a direct object. So you have to have a direct object first, and then maybe there'll be an indirect object. So as you can imagine, indirect objects are kind of rare because not every action verb has a direct object, and not every direct object has an indirect object. So, there is a chain there. And as you can imagine, if indirect objects receive a direct object, they have to come after transitive action verbs. They may not come after linking verbs. In a properly constructed sentence, a grammatically correct sentence, the indirect object always comes before the direct object, comes to the left of the direct object. If you find something that you think is an indirect object and it's after the direct object, you've made a mistake. You've either switched the two or you have found something inside a prepositional phrase. But when done correctly, indirect object comes earlier in the sentence than the direct object. So, unless it's a question, you're always going to have this pattern. Subject, action verb, indirect object, direct object. S-A-V-I-O-D-O. That would be an awesome thing to write down in your notes and to have handy. And if I give you a quiz asking you to find parts of the sentence, you can write that up in the margin. S-A-V-I-O-D-O. It's always going to come in that order, unless it's in a question. The best analogy I can think of is with football. I'm not a big football fan, but it works. The subject, think of the subject as the quarterback, the one doing everything, the star of the show. The quarterback gets rewarded when the team does well, gets blamed when the team does badly. Quarterback's always the one in the press conference. Quarterback's the subject. And what do quarterbacks do? They throw. I know, they also run and stuff, but for this analogy, they throw. So that throwing motion that the quarterback does, that's the action verb. The direct object is the thing that gets thrown. And what gets thrown by a quarterback? The football. Football is a direct object. And there has to be someone on the other end, well, there doesn't have to be, but in this analogy, there's someone on the other end receiving that football. That's the wide receiver. The wide receiver is like the indirect object. So you can have a sentence like, Steve Young threw Jerry Rice the football. Steve Young and Jerry Rice were one of the best quarterback wide receiver combinations. They scored 92 touchdowns together. They were a great team. So Steve Young threw Jerry Rice the football. Notice how it follows that pattern. Subject, action verb, indirect object, direct object. So think about that. That's a nice analogy for subjects, action verbs, indirect objects, and direct objects. Some more examples can be, I gave my Valentine a balloon. No prepositional phrases to get rid of. The action verb is gave. Who does the giving? Who's doing the giving? The subject, I. So I'm the subject, gave is the action verb. The direct object is the thing that gets given, the balloon. Is there a receiver of the balloon? Yes. Valentine. Valentine is the indirect object. Next, she gave me one back. No prepositional phrases. She is the subject who's doing everything. What is she doing? Gave. Gave's an action verb. So she's the subject, gave is the action verb. The direct object is the thing that gets given. One. Here's one of those tricky pronouns, but we didn't want to say balloon again, so we just said the pronoun one. And who receives one? Me. Me is the indirect object. And you'll remember from our subject lesson that there's a whole different set of pronouns that we use for objects than we do for subjects. For objects, we use me, you, her, him, it, us, them, whom. Notice how many of them end in M. But we use object pronouns in the direct object and the indirect object spot. We use subject pronouns in the subject spot. And one other place, which we'll talk about later. Okay, another example. Without warning, his dog gave him a bite. All right, first thing we need to do, look for prepositional phrases, and we have one, without warning. So let's cross that out. That makes the sentence shorter, fewer places to make mistakes. So the sentence that's left, his dog gave him a bite. Who's doing the action? Dog. Dog's the subject. The verb is what the dog does. Gave. The direct object is the thing that gets given. A bite. Bite is the direct object. Don't get mixed up with bite as a verb. This is a bite. You know it's a noun because it has the article a in front of it. So a bite is the direct object. And who receives the bite? Him. Him is the indirect object. Receives the bite. Notice it follows the right pattern. S-A-V-I-O-D-O. Next, my mom asked my sister and me a question. No prepositional phrases to worry about. Who's the subject? Mom. Verb, asked. And yes, asked is an action verb. The direct object is the thing that gets asked. Question. Now, who receives the question? Let's think about this. Sister and me. It's a compound indirect object. We have two of them. They're joined by a conjunction. It's totally fine to have a compound indirect object. You can also have compound direct objects, compound subjects, even compound verbs. So there's two indirect objects. You have to make sure you get them both. Next sentence. The teacher gave Susie a book. No prep phrases. Subject's teacher. Verb is gave. What gets given? Book. Book's the direct object. Who receives the book? Susie. Susie's the indirect object. And look at this one. The teacher gave a book to Susie. Oh, this is tricky. It really feels like the book is the direct object and who receives the book? Susie. But remember, S-A-V-I-O-D-O. The indirect object has to come earlier in the sentence than the direct object. So Susie can't be the indirect object because Susie comes after the direct object book. And we notice that to Susie is a prepositional phrase. If we had crossed out our prepositional phrases first, we would not have been tempted to label Susie as the indirect object. Cross out that prep phrase, there's nothing left to receive the book, so there's no indirect object. That's why it's so important to cross out the prep phrases first. Try the following sentences on your own. When you see it, pause the video, find the indirect objects, and then when you hit play again, I'll show you what the indirect objects are.